Hello everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. Have you ever looked in the mirror and seen something you didn't like? Something unfamiliar? It probably has more to do with what we feel inside, but I think it's normal to struggle with what we see sometimes. That's why it's usually our goal to get to a place where we not only recognize who we see in the mirror, but also that we're comfortable with them. Of course, that's if them is referring to you. Because what's even more terrifying than seeing a version of yourself you don't recognize is seeing someone else entirely you don't recognize, standing right alongside you. You're no longer facing off against your internal demons. These ones have fully manifested into something outside of you. And the question is, what do you do next? Well, I think tonight's stories at least offer a couple of different choices and their consequences. So, let's get started, shall we? Growing up, I had multiple paranormal experiences, and this one still freaks me out. I've always been skeptical, so I do my best to find explanations, but sometimes there just isn't one. Many of these instances happened when others were around to see it as well, so I know it's not my imagination. As a teenager, I started becoming a little too interested in the paranormal, and I wasn't afraid of anything. At one point, I began dabbling with something I shouldn't have, and things got a little too intense. I had a friend who would randomly change the subject of conversation to weird, creepy shit that didn't make sense. Then, he'd suddenly stop and not remember anything he said. Usually, he went back to the original topic, and that would be the end of it. But when we were 15, he went into these trances while we were on the phone. That time he said,
"Follow the tracks to your right, then, near the end, you'll come to their resting place."
The layout of my old trailer park is important for the next parts. It was a pretty nice one. I lived in a small town, and the park was in a heavily wooded, secluded area. The driveway divided the park in half and came to a dead end at the rear. Just past that was an embankment, and at the bottom, there was an old railroad track that ended in the woods. On one side was an old abandoned mill. On the other side was a dense thicket of trees in a neighborhood. It was late summer afternoon when I followed the cryptic directions down to the railroad tracks. Near the end, I heard footsteps in the woods to my right, and I headed up the embankment for a closer look. Nobody was there, but I found a small graveyard, curiously tucked away behind the neighborhood. It's most likely a small family plot from the early 1800s. There were only 20 markers at most, but nothing weird ever happened there. Another late afternoon, my friend went into a trance. He said,
"Head to the tracks, cross them. When you enter the woods, you'll see him."
I was cocky, so I did just that. This time, I crossed the path behind the trailer park. They passed through a small section of woods before entering a clearing to the old mill on the left. And on the right are miles of power lines. The moment I entered the tree line, I heard snapping branches, and I saw the black silhouette of a man galloping by on a black horse before disappearing into the trees. Horses weren't a common sight around my town, so I decided to investigate the area he came from. Near the edge of the tree line, I found an old, collapsed horse stable. Nothing else nearby. If he continued in the same direction, he'd eventually reach another neighborhood, but there was nothing else around. Intrigued, I called to update my friend, but he refused to believe me. The following day, I took him to the location, and as we entered the tree line, we saw the horseman, taking the same path as I had the night before. It was broad daylight. There's no way we both imagined it. We were freaked out, but we continued to the stable ruins. The strangest part of it all was the fact that I brought a few other friends to see the stable, and every time the horseman appeared. After finding the stable, each encounter became more intense. TVs and stereos would turn on by themselves, even when others were present. I experienced intense feelings of being watched and inexplicable moments of dread for no reason. Sometimes when home alone, I would hear muffled conversations or music, like a radio was playing in another room. Stuff would randomly and violently fly across the room. Handprints often appeared on the bathroom mirror after a steamy shower. Sometimes I'd hear the familiar sound of Mom coming home, only to realize nobody was there. Then, one night around 2 or 3, I got bored. I went to the graveyard. I was super uneasy. It felt like I was being watched, but I'm stubborn and refused to back down. Upon arrival, the graveyard was quiet, and feeling dumb, I decided to leave. I was halfway up the trailer park embankment when I heard something rustle and looked up to see the horseman looking down at me. He was pitch black. You could see his outline, but nothing reflected light. It was very similar to how shadow people are described. I stared in disbelief for a few seconds, but snapped out of it when the horse snorted. Turning back, I ran down the embankment and along the tracks as the sound of hoofbeats followed. I went back into the woods and I weaved through the trees in hopes of slowing my pursuer. Finally, I reached the street and ran to our trailer, practically diving through the front door, all while the hoofbeats were still hot on my trail. Mom was at work, so I turned on every light and TV, as if they could somehow keep the horseman at bay, and eventually, I fell asleep on the couch. Upon waking, it was daylight, and Mom was just getting home. I told her everything that happened, and she said I shouldn't be playing with the paranormal as if it were a toy. She's always shared her own experiences regularly, so she had no trouble believing mine. When the sun finally came up, I returned to the embankment, wondering if I somehow imagined it all. Maybe there was simply a lost horse in the area. I don't know. But I found hoof prints in the sand atop the embankment and nowhere else. That's when I decided to take a break from the paranormal. I'm normally not religious, but I prayed for these things to stop, and I swore I wouldn't mess with them again. Everything really did seem to die down. When I turned 18, it stopped completely. I haven't had a single experience since. I think my experiences started with the violent abuse of my childhood. Entities would try attaching themselves to me, and it kind of darkened my presence. At a young age, my dad asked why I stopped smiling, and that continued for decades. Meanwhile, I've always had visions, and in my 30s, I moved to a place with a heavy, hidden, satanic element. I definitely disturbed the energy in that place because I had powerful dreams when I was there. Plus, I think something cursed me. That brings me to 12 years ago, when I met an attractive woman who was treating her depression with meth. She even admitted to doing very bad things to people. At the same time, I was also having visions that didn't make sense until I met her. She was a black magic practitioner, and through phone sex, she was somehow able to attach a demon to me. I went to a Cherokee shaman named Raven, who said the black magic practitioner was actually a djinn, and she was spiritually attacking others through me. It was bizarre, to say the least. The more I learned, the more I tried to help others who were being attacked by covens, and because of that, the covens in turn began to target me. It was brutal. For years, my energy was drained daily to the point of delirium. Eventually, I had a vision of a dark cloaked figure coming into my mind's eye, and he said, "I can't destroy you. Your faith in God is unbreakable, but I will devour the ones who attack you." Then, I saw several groups of people standing around altars and performing blood rituals, summoning demons to attack me. The figure said his name was Az, and that only 3 fallen angels have that sound in their name, which I took that to mean that he was Azazel. Several days later, I felt the death of the Jinn's sister. All that time, I'd been praying, surrendering to the divine, and just not specifying God or Christ. It helped me to see that there were other solutions to attempt. I tried praying to every culture's deities, but to no avail. Finally, I found a guy that had traveled the world looking for the same solution. He said that prayers to the Christian God were the only solution that worked. Well, I tried it, even though I wasn't very big on the Bible when living in that satanic place. Before all that began, I had rage issues, PTSD, was diagnosed as borderline paranoid schizophrenic. But as the years passed, I started praying to God every day, all day. Eventually, my troubles began to lessen. My energy returned. The paranoia stopped. My PTSD went away along with the borderline schizophrenia. Though during that time, my visions were going haywire. I've had a handful of instances where demons entered my mind's eye for a chat, and this has been a heavily condensed summary of those experiences. At age 8, I woke from a vivid nightmare at 4 a.m. It was about bright green locusts and porcelain dolls. I laid awake for a while, too spooked to go back to sleep, but eventually I went downstairs to watch TV before school. I was sitting on the sofa, and to my right was the glass door leading upstairs. From the corner of my eye, I see a light up there, and when I turned, I saw a figure. It was a glowing, pale blue shape, with an open robe and hood. There were no facial features, just 2 shiny red eyes. It was beckoning me forward with its left hand. I've never felt terror like that before. I slapped my hands to my face, hiding my eyes from the figure. I felt trapped. I didn't want to open my eyes, but I had nowhere to go. My only options were upstairs, past the figure, or through the kitchen behind me. With a rush of adrenaline, I ran straight upstairs with my eyes closed, right by whatever might have been standing in the doorway. I dove into bed and hid under the covers until my dad got up for work. I kept going into his room asking if he was getting up soon, and he eventually went downstairs as I followed behind. There was no sign of anything, but my heart was still racing, and I was terrified. I followed Dad all the way to the bathroom and virtually stood behind him as he peed. Finally, I found the courage to tell him what I saw, but he was a skeptic and said it was just my imagination. I could almost believe him. I was a pretty weird kid. I loved horror and the paranormal, but I'd never experienced anything like this. The whole feeling of it was strange. I still remember it like it was yesterday, even all these years later. I thought the nightmare could have sent my imagination into overdrive, or that light was reflecting off of the glass panels, and my brain processed that image of the phantom. There's only one thing that doesn't let me dismiss it completely. When I came downstairs that night, I wasn't alone. Our cat was there too. Fugly was a big silver Persian that my dad thought was hideous, hence the name. This was a very docile cat. You could do anything to her and she would just keep purring. She didn't have a bad bone in her body. When I followed Dad through the kitchen, I saw Fugly on one of the dining room chairs, tucked under the table. When I bent down to look at her, she was severely spooked. Her eyes were saucers, her fur standing up straight. She was nearly twice her size. I put my hand towards her, but she hissed and scratched my hand hard enough to draw blood. This really stayed with me. She'd never acted like that before, nor did she ever display that behavior again after. So, that's my only experience. I love the paranormal and I'm pretty open-minded. What's your opinion? Do I have an overactive imagination, or could it have been something else? Has anyone seen something similar? I moved into my apartment 9 years ago. Before the early 2010s, when it was converted into lofts, it was a factory. I wanted to make this post because I've had some strange experiences over the years. Experiences that have led me down the rabbit hole of an unsolved murder from 1998. I'm mostly wondering if this will line up with anyone else's story. Shortly after moving in, I was living alone and had fallen asleep in front of the TV. When I woke up, I stepped into a thick puddle of liquid that definitely wasn't there when I fell asleep. The puddle was roughly 1 foot in diameter, and there was no obvious explanation for it. There were no air ducts or underlying pipework, and I wasn't drinking anything that could have fallen over. It was too thick and viscous to be water. Plus, it smelled like coconut shampoo. After cleaning it up, I called my parents to get their opinion. They said to keep a lookout in case there was a leak somewhere else that was simply coming through in that area. It never happened again, but that's what prompted me to start checking this stuff out on the internet. When I searched for explanations of liquids appearing, it eventually led me to a discussion about poltergeists. Initially, I rationalized that poltergeists only existed in places where some form of trauma had occurred. And I wasn't sure if that was true in this case. I wasn't a true skeptic back then, but I've never been the type of person to poke the bear, as they say. Long story short, that's when I learned my building used to be a factory. In 1998, the owner was murdered in the parking lot. And while the case is technically still unsolved, an officer was quoted as saying they know who did it. There just wasn't enough evidence to prosecute. Upon learning this, I understood the connection and began mentioning the story to others in the building, along with my strange liquid experience. I figured this murdered soul wanted to be acknowledged, and ever since I started telling the story, nothing else has physically happened. Though, recently, I've started suspecting other types of experiences. For the past year, whenever I work in my home office, I get a sense of being shot in the head. At least, what I imagine it would feel like. It happens when I'm awake. They aren't dreams. It's like my mind drifts into it. It's really hard to explain. It's like a memory of a car passing by, and suddenly, I feel my head clock back violently. This has been a reoccurring thing that comes and goes, but it only happens at night. I think the spirit is trying to communicate how they felt when they died. When I first started researching the murder, I didn't read where the victim was shot. It was only when I went back to review the articles that I realized it was a mob hit with a getaway car. 3 men shot the victim, once in the head, twice in the stomach. The murder happened at 7 a.m., and occasionally, my stomach will randomly hurt at that time, only to be completely fine the rest of the day. Has anyone had similar experiences? Is there anything I could do to put the spirit at ease? Oh, and another element of this murder is that after the victim was killed, people found out that he had a mistress in Florida who was married to a famous Miami chef. The location of the murder was in Toronto, Canada. This is short, but I can't stop thinking about it. First, you need to know that I'm a ghost magnet. Seriously, there's something about me that attracts spirits. I don't know what it is, but lately, I've been trying to ignore them while I deal with my depression. The other day was completely normal until I went to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. Behind my reflection stood a very tall figure with a hairy head and no eyes, dangling arms. It wore a black and white outfit, and it scared the shit out of me. When I looked back at my own reflection, it was still standing straight and smiling back at me. I know that's not what I looked like at the moment. It kept looking straight into my eyes as I backed out of the bathroom and into my own. I closed my door, turned on all the lights, got into bed where I resumed my "this isn't real" chant. Eventually, I fell asleep and woke up the next morning, but when I went to the bathroom, nothing was out of the ordinary. Does anyone have a clue what's going on? It's freaking me out. I used to work as a nurse in an old folks' home, and we had one lady who never ate or drank but seemed to live forever. She spoke multiple languages, but she had a strange way of talking. Most of her interactions ended with her laughing and the other person crying. She'll insult people and the people that they care about. There have also been instances where she bit people in the arms or hands. Sometimes she bit them in the neck if they came too close. She laughed at the idea of religion, and her heavy door closed by itself anytime someone entered her cold room. The entire staff believed that there was something more at work here, but the higher-ups never believed in the paranormal. I stopped working there, but a friend told me the woman died shortly after I quit. After the weird woman died, her neighbor also passed away. She hadn't been a fan of living there either. 2 new residents moved into their rooms, but 1 week later, they also passed away. I haven't spoken to any of my old coworkers since the news. That stuff is too scary for me. After I wrote this, I tried contacting one of my friends who used to work there, but he didn't want to talk about it. He's in therapy. His second child is on the way, and he finally found a new house. He wasn't trying to reopen old wounds, and I have to respect that. I've dealt with the paranormal for most of my life. One day, my cousin and I were hanging out at the house, alone except for my beautiful white cat. I was 18 at the time. My brother was at the store with friends. Our mother had recently died, and I had quite a few paranormal experiences there. But they never bothered me. It was never anything that seemed malicious or dangerous, only fun stuff like electronics turning on and random footsteps walking around. One time, my cousin was sitting on my bed when he felt someone sit next to him. He screamed and ran out of the house. But I should get back to my current story. I was sitting on my bed, and my cousin was in the living room. My room was only separated from the living room by a glass door and a curtain, so we were only 20 feet away from each other. We were talking about girls when we heard what sounded like a spoon falling to the floor in the kitchen. We listened for more, but when nothing else happened, we resumed our conversation. That's when my cat came to sit with me, and I began petting her. A few minutes later, more utensils clattered to the floor. I was more surprised now that I knew it wasn't the cat. Still, even more utensils fell, and these were followed by the much louder bang of a falling pot. My cousin, unable to see the cat in my lap, advised me to check on her, and when I pulled back the curtain, his eyes opened wide in shock. If she was there, he wanted to know who was in the kitchen. But I explained. Nobody was in there. He didn't believe me at first, but almost as if on cue, there was a huge commotion in the kitchen. Spoons, pots, and pans, plates, glass, everything was being thrown. It continued for roughly 30 seconds before coming to a sudden stop. Once it was over, I asked my cousin to go check on the kitchen, but he adamantly refused, suggesting I take a look instead. Needless to say, I was equally against the idea. As we argued over who would go, my brother and his friends returned from the store. Without hesitation, I shouted for my brother to go into the kitchen. He refused until I said my leg hurt and asked for a drink. Then he finally agreed. He brought me a glass of water, and I took it. Puzzled by his lack of reaction to the mess, I asked if he saw anything in the kitchen, but he was confused as to why I would even ask. When he insisted nothing had been out of place, I told him the whole story. He was furious. Hey everyone, I'm 33, in good health, and I come from Lower Saxony, Germany. Yes, sometimes life has been troubling, but I've always been open-minded when it comes to the paranormal. 2 weeks ago, I had a nightmare that took place in my room. I dreamed that my bedroom was a movie set. To the left of my bed was my grandparents' old cupboard. To the right was a newer cupboard. and the window was across from the bed. In the dream, I was laying on my right side when someone grabbed me. I slowly turned around and saw someone sitting next to me. I couldn't tell their gender, but they had long hair, and they were facing the opposite direction. When I touched their back, they turned around and I shouted, "Who are you?" Suddenly, the figure was gone, and frightened, I got up to look out the window. That's when I woke up shouting. But I was also experiencing sleep paralysis, so I couldn't move. It's happened before, so I knew what was going on. I wondered why the blinds were still down, because I hadn't realized that I was still dreaming when I looked outside. First, I wondered who the person had been. I live alone. I don't have a girlfriend. My grandmother has lived in a retirement home since May, and my grandfather passed away, but he didn't die in the apartment. I've read that many people see an entity when experiencing sleep paralysis, but I'm not sure if seeing it before I woke up still counts. The last time I had sleep paralysis was in 2019, and before that, it was 2012. During the 2019 experience, I was in my ex-girlfriend's living room. When I woke up, I couldn't move, and someone was walking down the hallway towards the front door. Like I said, I've been pretty open-minded when it comes to the paranormal. 7 years ago, my grandfather died from a tumor, but now I need to circle back to that cupboard that came from his old house in 2007. That's the house my great-grandmother died in on December 24th, 1999. I suspect it was the source behind the activity. I do feel like someone is here, but in a good way. I know it sounds far-fetched, but that's how it feels. I didn't feel this way when my grandparents still lived in the house. Of course, I was younger then. A few months ago, there was another incident in the living room where I have a second cupboard from my grandparents. It contains a few old books about nature, and one just fell over. Nothing was shaking. It wasn't standing in a strange angle. It simply fell over, and I was pretty scared. What are your thoughts? I'm not too frightened anymore. I have good feelings about my grandmother and grandfather. They were the best people I've ever known. But could all of this have something to do with their furniture? There's a recording from what we experienced at 1:07 a.m., July 31st, 2022, which was my 40th birthday. We were parked at the north end of I-75 rest stop, between the Mount Morris and Montrose exits, right outside of Flint, Michigan, the place where you can't drink the water. We've slept down there hundreds of times, and the woods surrounding it usually inspire an eerie feeling. But we've never experienced anything like what happened that night. I fell asleep shortly after we got there, but my wife was still awake, fixing her hair when she noticed a long, white rectangle standing in the forest directly across from our car. A bright white light was pouring out of it, as if someone in a dark room had opened the door to one filled with insanely bright lights. Then she saw the outline of a shadow figure standing in the doorway. She said it gave off an intensely sinister, evil feeling as it stood, motionless and staring at her. At first, she thought it must be a hallucination or a dream. She couldn't believe such a thing could really be happening. But once she realized it wasn't simply her imagination, she became frightened and woke me up. The moment I opened my eyes, I saw what she saw. a bright, white doorway with a shadow man staring at us. I immediately told her to get the hell out of there, and she did, quickly. We drove towards the rest stop's exit and parked, but as we drove away, this thing flew out of the portal with what I can only describe as angel wings. It followed our car across the parking lot. That's the part I recorded, though sadly, I didn't get any footage of the original portal. The entity looked like a robed angel, holding a staff with his arms out and head back. But it also looks like a portal with angel wings and spirits passing through. Then it shows 4 lights hovering above it. 2 are green and 2 are orange. We sat there, recording it and talking, but whatever this thing was, it didn't have the scary feeling my wife felt before. Now it felt calm, like it was protecting us. But after a while, we both got freaked out again and left shortly after. I know people will say the lights are from my dashboard, but we even debunked that in the video by holding my hands in front of the dash lights. A lot disappeared, but not this. The entity stayed, disappeared for a split second, and came right back. To leave, we were forced to drive right past it, and we saw it clear as day through the driver's side window. You can also see it in the rearview mirrors. This is not fake or some kind of scam. I've had the pictures and the video recording for almost 6 months now, and I need answers. If anyone has experienced this before, please take a look. Let me know what you think. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode, but don't miss a brand new one every Friday night, and my other weekly uploads every Sunday and Wednesday. I want to thank those who shared their stories, and a big thanks to all of you for listening. Huge shout out to all of my patrons whom I appreciate so very much. TRACY S, TAMARA K, Monica L, ZOEWATT, Shelly B, Donald C, Rat Girl, ALISHA S, ERIN G, NIKKI H, Mr. REVENANT, Naz K, BRENDON G, Paul T, and Nicholas C. If you want to support The Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining my Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour. Or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.